Hi, I'm Rusty Dornan with the Kaufman Fellows Academy, and very happy to welcome back Chris Lipp. He's the instructor and author of The Startup Pitch, and we're going to be talking today about your effective strategies and persuasion and your 4-point formula. So welcome, Chris, back to the Google Hangout.
Thank you, Rusty. Pleasure.
Okay, you talked before about 90% of pitches starting with a problem. How important is it to frame that problem properly?
Well, let's back up so we understand exactly what that means. So a lot of entrepreneurs think that pitching is about conveying information about their startup. And generally, that perspective on pitching is going to lead to failure in winning funding. Because the point of a pitch is to convey value of your startup to your audience. And if you convey enough value, then you're able to take that value and trade it for their money. So when we think of the problem, what our job is in introducing the problem is to introduce why what we're bringing to market is going to be valuable to our customers. So if we frame the problem, just to answer your question, if we frame the problem, the optimal way is to frame it so that it maximizes visibility on the need of the consumers or the customers. And if you have competition, perhaps even focusing on the problems with existing solutions, which would be your competitors.
How much do you end up talking about the problem before you really launch into the solution for your product and that sort of thing? I mean, do you spend a long time on it? Do you just hook them with it? What's the best way to do it?
Great question. And I remember we went over this actually in a previous Google Hangout. What we find is investors don't want to hear the problem for too long. And so if we look at pitches that have won funding, we see they take anywhere from 30 to 90 seconds to go through their problem. 30 seconds if it's a very obvious problem, 90 seconds if they need more context around that. For example, if we look at Enigma, who pitched at TechCrunch Disrupt in 2013, and they were the winner, what they did was they spent 90 seconds on the problem of public data access. Because people didn't understand public data access, a lot of the people in the audience, they needed to go through that. But still, it only took them 90 seconds for context plus the problem.
Okay, I'm noticing some people are joining us, and if you have any questions for author and instructor Chris Lipp with the Startup Pitch, please feel free to type in your questions. What if your product solves multiple problems? How do you choose which one? Do you just really focus on one, or should you bring up the other ones?
We know that the easier it is for an investor to follow your pitch, the more persuasive you are. So the risk of bringing up multiple problems is that it really loses the investor in like, okay, does it solve this? Does it solve that? What is the real issue here? They don't have one stream that they can follow. They have multiple. You don't want to do that. You want to really focus them to what is the most impactful issue that you are solving. So really focus on one and then avoid the others. That way the investor will pay more attention to you.
Great. We do have a question here from one of our viewers. At the end of pitching to VCs, if they ask me in detail about how much funds do I want and ask me to provide detailed financial projections and project plan, is that a good sign?
That is a great sign. So if an investor is willing to do a deep dive into your data with you, usually that happens in a second meeting. It's called the due diligence meeting. So if they want to do due diligence with you, that's a very, very good sign.
Jumping back to the problem, just because I have a lot of questions on it, to me it's fascinating. What if your company doesn't solve any problem? What do you do then?
So we've mentioned this before too, and I know many entrepreneurs have asked me this question. Let's take advice from who is probably the greatest innovator of the 21st century, Steve Jobs. Right? Steve Jobs created an iPod, created an iPad, created an iPhone. We didn't really know we had problems missing those until we had it, and we're like, oh yeah, this changes my life. So what Jobs did, he would always talk about industry trends and where those trends were going. And then he would position his product to fulfill those trends. Let's take an example. If we look at the iPod, Steve Jobs said, there's right now there's a trend for music going digital, a technology trend. There's a trend with people taking their music with them mobily, so a social trend, when they go on their Walkmans or whatnot when they go on vacation. And there's also a trend, a cost trend in terms of storing digital music, not on flash drives, not in burned CDs, but on hard drives. So Jobs then presented his solution as this: what if we made a mobile device player that stored music digitally on hard drives, thus fulfilling the social, technology, and cost trends? What we have, it's called the iPod. That's how you would present your problem if you didn't have an explicit problem per se.
Okay, we have another question from a viewer. What if you are introducing a product which has been tackled by other startups, but you believe your solution is superior? Google would be an example.
Well, there's a couple of great things about coming in with that type of product. One is you don't have to give a lot of background on the problem or the market, because likely the investor has heard a lot about that. So what you need to do is you need to focus, what is your differentiation? And in that case, you might actually do a couple things. One thing you could do is you could focus your problem not on the industry problem, but on the problem of the previous startups that have attempted to solve your problem, thus differentiating yourself from these companies. After doing that, you're obviously talking about the features and benefits that make your product unique, but a lot of it is also the team. So what is it about your team that maybe makes you more likely as a startup to succeed than previous teams?
Yeah, and again, how much do you bring in your team? Do you bring in your team on the startup? How much do you tout that? I guess depending on what their backgrounds are, but is it a good idea to bring them in? I mean, when you're presenting.
Well, you're presenting, it's irrelevant. I mean, mostly the investors want to speak to the CEO because the CEO is going to be the face of the company. So they're doing a few things. A, they're making sure that the CEO knows the company. But B, they're also checking to see whether or not you can communicate in front well enough to win customers, which is part of the CEO's job.
How about, we know storytelling is kind of essential in successful pitches, but what about, the analogies, anecdotes, war stories, what's good to bring in?
So Rusty, you're going to put me out of a job here because we're going to go over all the great secrets I have. And
Oh, no.
By the time you're here, everybody listening is going to have like this amazing pitch. So I'm very envious of all of you. What is the value of a story? A lot of value. We know from research, field research, that successful startups need to have some sort of emotional component in their pitch in order to really move the decision-making psychological processes within investors. So data is great. Again, data makes it real, but it's really some emotional component either around the pain of the problem or the benefits of the solution that's going to get them to say, hey, yeah, this is awesome. One way to do that, and one way we see politicians do all the time, and that should just tell you the efficaciousness of this topic, of the strategy, the effectiveness of the strategy, the fact that politicians are using it, right, is just saying an anecdote, right? The soccer mom, the Joe who I met at the street corner told me, et cetera, et cetera. But the way we would do that in our pitches is we would talk about stories we've had with customers or our own personal experiences around either the problem or the solution.
Okay. You brought up in that last answer, data. What does showing data do for you in a pitch?
So there are two types of investors, let's just say. There are those who really want to see data and those who really want to understand the meaning, sort of the emotional understanding of your product. They both exist. You'll always see them. You go to a pitch competition, you'll see a panel of investors. One will say, I wanted more data, and one will say, I wanted more story. I wanted to understand the product more. But even the most emotionally based investors still need some data in order to feel like what you're saying is not just imagination, that there is some grounding in reality of what you're doing. Okay,
we have another question from a viewer. How long should the pitch be? When you use the word pitch, does it correspond to all you are going to prepare for a first meeting interview with a VC or angel? Is a pitch equal to a prepared talk with a deck?
Yes. It's your meeting. It's going to be the way that you interact with an investor. There's a couple of things you should know about this. One is that it's going to be a conversation. So it's not something that you're going to do, say, at a pitch competition where you stand up and deliver for 2 minutes straight or 5 minutes straight. Having said that, I'm going to give Guy Kawasaki's rule, which is the 10-20-30 rule. 10 slides, 20-minute presentation with 30-point font. What I have seen successful startups do is they'll prepare, say, 5 to 7 minutes worth of content that's very, very honed. And they will deliver that, but they'll get interrupted with questions. They'll answer the questions, and they'll go back to that content which they've rooted on, which the investors they feel must hear in order to understand their value. But it could take, even though they've only prepared 7 minutes of content, with Q&A it could take 30 minutes, 40 minutes to go through.
Let's talk about that too, because there really are, the two different ways in presenting the pitches. The one where you stand up in front of the audience and you're giving them your hard sell, for a few minutes, and then the one that you're talking about now, which is the real conversation with investors. Mm-hmm. Should you be really practicing both of those and figuring out how you're going to present both of those and have them just kind of ready to go?
One individual I worked with here at Stanford, and we actually did a separate project, but he was accepted into Y Combinator, and he had practiced his pitch, just the pitch, for at least a month, going in and out of various meetings with investors. But the nights before he met Y Combinator, and anybody who's pitched to Y Combinator I have, they grill you with questions. They don't really allow you to sell too much. So the nights before, leading up to his meeting with them, with Paul Graham, he and his team practiced Q&A for at least 4 or 5 hours. They just hammer questions back and forth, and they kept practicing until basically the answers were smooth, crisp, clear, and gave the information they thought was most valuable. Take that contrary to the approach of somebody who doesn't practice Q&A, who knows everything. They'll be able to answer the questions, but what's going to happen to you is you won't be concise. We know precision correlates to persuasiveness, so you won't be concise, you won't be persuasive. You may miss things that are probably the most important things for them to hear, and you won't have been able to frame things in a way that is adding value. You'll just be adding information to the investor. And again, the point of a pitch is not to convey information, it's to convey value.
Okay. I know we're going to be coming up on doing elevator pitches later in the course, but we do have a question about it. How do you compare an elevator pitch to a pitch? Is an elevator pitch a concentrative pitch, or is it a bait to arrive to a pitch presentation?
We hear that a lot, that you really want to get somebody, after you give your elevator pitch, to them thinking, wow, yeah, tell me more. And so you create mystery. And sure, there's a lot of different kind of communication techniques per se that would work. But an elevator pitch, ultimately, your goal is to, within a very short amount of time, and we're talking 10, 15 seconds, be able to say exactly what you do and why it's valuable. And if you have conveyed the value in your elevator pitch, not with some gimmicky hook or anything, but if you've conveyed value, they'll be like, oh, that sounds great, tell me more. You tell them a little more, and then you really interest them. You'll email them and hopefully set up a meeting.
Great. Your book is excellent and really helped me, still refining. What are some tips for live pitches where VCs go off the presentation and for VC versus conference pitches?
So if a VC's questions go off presentation, try to understand what is it they're seeking. So again, you want to convey value, and what's going to happen is when you walk in there, you're assuming you know what their value is. That's why you prepare your problem, you prepare your benefits. But they may have a different frame. And if you can understand from their questioning where they're going, like what they consider to be valuable in a startup, you can begin to shift your mindset and think, oh, this is maybe what I need to do is I need to talk about it from this perspective. So you might reintroduce the problem from a slightly different angle. Case in point, recently I had I run another group here on Stanford campus. We deal with just influential communication. So it's pitching beyond startups to major projects, getting things done. So, for example, there's a guy I was coaching. He's pitching for a $300,000 project. He needed a budget for that. And what he did was he went into this meeting and he had his whole problem solution laid out, benefits. And as he pitched, the guy he was pitching to, the administrator, like losing interest. So at the end of it, the guy's like, yeah, whatever. And so my friend turned around, my colleague turned around, and he started asking, what interests you? And so the administrator started talking about interests to him. And my colleague basically said, look, here's a problem that you're having. So he realigned to the problem of his audience, and then he positioned his solution in reference to that problem. So long story short, if an investor starts going off your pitch with their questions, try to identify what their needs are, and then re-hone your pitch to fulfill their needs, not the ones you walked in with.
Okay, next question. Thanks for the great advice and for doing this. I'm faced with this dilemma if I should pitch only when I have the prototype ready. I'm afraid investors would not take me seriously with something that is just on paper or PowerPoint. I'm sure you've heard this dilemma before, Chris.
Yeah. Well, Guy Kawasaki says, I would rather see a prototype than a pitch without a prototype, or a prototype without a pitch than a pitch without a prototype, in part because when you deliver a prototype, it reduces the risk that you can deliver a product, right? Investors are looking for low-risk, high-return investments. Low-risk, high-return. So the prototype lowers the risk that you're going to be able to bring something to market. Let's say that's not possible now. Let's say that you're at a stage where you need funding in order to produce a prototype. Then what you need to do is you still need to lower the risk that a prototype can be developed. And the way you would do that is you could do testing. So for example, another pitch that I watched a while back, in which I was actually paneling for, they were producing silent technology for vehicles, both in the air and in the ground. They wanted to do a noise cancellation, kind of like what we saw with the U.S. military doing with helicopters. That takes a lot of money to produce, particularly because it's hardware, right? And so what I and my investor colleagues on the panel were saying was, it would be great if you had just done lab tests to show you can produce noise cancellation effects on a small scale. Then we can understand how you could build a larger device that can do this.
If you have an idea that clearly fits the U.S. market and you're aiming to launch it there, get investors from U.S., but your team is based in Europe, does it make any sense to run such a business with a team that is not based in the U.S., and could it work like that?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow. One more time.
I think it's a little off the pitch subject, but he's saying that he wants to launch his product in the U.S. and get investors from the U.S., but the team is in Europe. Mm-hmm. Is it easy to get? Can you get investors to jump on board with something like that, where the investors are in the U.S. and maybe the team's in Europe? Is that going to work? Are investors going to be interested in something like that?
Think about it from the investor's perspective. So they need to make sure that they can work with you to be successful. So how is that communication going to work if you're in Europe? This is not a judgment. It's a question to think about. Think about what are the investors' concerns going to be with where you are versus where they are. How will that influence? They'll think, okay, these guys are from Europe. Do they understand the U.S. market? Are they there to talk to U.S. customers? If we mentor them, are we going to be able to have an easy way to communicate very quickly? So just think very logically about it. What are the hesitations? And then if you feel those hesitations are going to be a part of your pitch, you can address them.
Okay, the next one is sort of, he split it up in doing a demo of your product, e.g. mobile app. How would you compare the following? Simulation only, or MVP3, MVP, and some traction?
I'm assuming the question is because there might be some risk to doing the MVP with traction. For example, maybe there are some bugs that might happen while you're demoing. Understandable. If you've got traction, I think you've probably already got a pretty solid product, though. Again, think of it from the investor's point of view. They want to ensure that you can deliver a product. If you show a simulation, your delivery of the features of your product may come out smoother. That is fantastic, right? So you're increasing that aspect of your pitch. On the flip side, they may be asking, well, do they have a real product that can work? Because we see people simulating stuff all the time, and it's just like a big arts entertainment show as opposed to a real product. So if there's that threat there, then the MVP is way stronger because the MVP proves that you've got your product out there already.
Sort of an international question again, advice and comments for entrepreneurs who are not native English speakers.
Advice, just general advice?
I think, yeah, advice or comments. I think probably how do you handle it if you have to pitch and you're not a native English speaker? Maybe, I'm not sure if she's comfortable speaking English or not. She doesn't say. Maybe she could clarify the question a little more as we, but generally speaking, how do you judge that? Do you try to get somebody else, or do you try to do it on your own? Do you do it maybe with a PowerPoint? I don't know.
That's a difficult question. So I coached a bunch of people last week in India, and half of them they had good English, and half of them were difficult to understand. And so feedback that I was giving them, for example, were speak slower, right? Because the point is to convey you want to convey the understanding of what you're saying. Practice a lot. They'll see, the point of a pitch isn't to have a flashy presentation. You want to come out as authentic, and in being authentic, you'll come out as more trustworthy, increases your credibility, thus increasing your chances for funding. If your English is to a point where even with practice and with having somebody give feedback on your pace, that you still are having trouble, it might be wise to find a partner who could deliver the pitch.
Do investors usually get technical during a pitch? Do they want to know how exactly you're going to build that app or platform? Should I have a CTO in the team before I pitch, or can I buy the audience into the idea and then hire a CTO and team that can build it?
You're going to see a lot of investors who ask you how a product works. You're going to see a lot of investors lose interest if you try to explain how it works. Your goal during your pitch is to convey the value of your product. If an investor asks you how does it work, your job is to essentially convey that that it does work, right? That there's no magic to this, that you have a really working formula to it. What that means is summarize how it works. If they're very technical investors, they're going to be more interested than if they're less technical. If that's the case, definitely have your CTO there so that you can go in-depth discussion. If it's somebody who's like a finance guy and he asks you how it works, don't go deep dive into like the technology. Just stay kind of at a higher level that the investor can conceptually understand. And in those cases, you probably wouldn't need a CTO.
Okay. We have another question from NAGB. Thanks for clarifying my earlier dilemma. One more question. Any tips on producing a great explainer video that would also help as a pitch to potential investors? He's also asking, who am I? And he missed the introduction. I'm Rusty Dornan, and I'm with the Kaufman Fellows Academy. And so I help run the courses and do operations and that sort of thing. So again, any tips on producing a great explainer video that would also help as a pitch to potential investors?
Right. Well, first I'll just say, for you, Rusty is an amazing person. She's doing a huge program with KFA and she's got her fingers in all sorts of aspects of startups. Very knowledgeable. Just as an aside. But
thank you.
Your explainer video. The goal of an explainer video is very similar to the goal of a pitch. You want to convey value to your potential customers so that they purchase your product essentially. And you see this all the time in any advertising, right? The people aren't just showing you how to use a product, they're essentially explaining why you're using the product. So they'll have some upfront, really quick problem, like one sentence problem, like, do you ever get in this situation where this happens to you? Right? It's kind of like a very plain vanilla advertising slogan. But if you are able to convey value in the how-to video, and then as you're showing the how-to, you're explaining the benefits of that process, which is again value, then the investor sees the value to the customer, and that's going to attract them as a potential investor. Conversely, if you were to make a how-to video and you were simply to explain how you use your product without explaining why it's good, why there's a benefit, why it solves any problem, it's just information. It has no value to an investor.
How do you're just getting started, you don't have a lot of things that you can point out that you've achieved or anything like that. How do you use milestones when you're just getting started? How do you use that in your pitch, those in your pitch?
Well, if you're just getting started, I mean, are you really at a place where you get funding? Let's be reasonable. We want to get funding when we need it at a point where we pretty much could not proceed without it. You might actually do it before you get to that point, but you want to have something behind you that is going to, you got to build something that produces enough value that you can pitch that value to an investor. So anyway, to the question, milestones have two purposes. One, they show where you've been and thus what you've accomplished, proving that you're accomplishing something, and thus showing that this is not just some kind of up in the air idea and you could jump off ship and go to another idea very quickly if somebody invests in you, right? Investors want to see that you're competent. At the flip side, and I don't know if this was assumed in the question or not, but you have future milestones as well, and those are pretty straightforward, in which you set them, and then an investor asks you why you are asking for money. You can basically explain that with this milestone, you need the funding to reach it. You go more in depth than that, but you need that future milestone in order to validate the need for funding.
Okay, final question. You talk about in your book, you say investors don't just listen to, quote, what you say. They're listening to kind of a subtext. And what are those subtexts? What are investors looking for besides just the exact information you're giving them?
Let's say you're going to invest in someone. All right, now you've got maybe $10,000 in the bank. I don't know, and one of your friends comes by and they want to start, or somebody you don't even know. Right? So you're going to be watching for a few things. You're going to be listening to the idea, but you're going to be looking at their character. How are they presenting? Does this person seem like charismatic enough, or at least somebody who can get customers? Do they appear competent? And this is particularly important. The way you communicate, people make a huge amount of judgments on that. Like, does this person think logically, just based on the way you're talking? Because they can't see your thinking, right? Is this person trustworthy? So if you're very hesitant to explain any of your weaknesses or to show sort of any vulnerability of your company within the pitch, well, investor's going to be like, he's hiding something, or she's hiding something, right? So in the presentation, there's always that subtext of, what is this person's character? That comes not from any sort of preparation, except in how much you yourself are consciously choosing to be open and honest in what you deliver.
Okay. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. And I do want to let people know the class is still open. So if you're interested in taking Startup Pitch with Chris Lipp, you just go to novawed.com/startup-pitch. And you can join the class. And also, we do highly recommend that you do buy Chris's book. It really fleshes out a lot more information, and it's available on Amazon on Kindle.
Yeah,
so,
just to that point, you guys out there, just last week I got another client to get $100K off of an hour and a half we worked together. And what you're going to get in this course that Rusty's telling you is you're going to get a lot more than just an hour and a half. You're going to get even deeper techniques that will hopefully get you, the $1 million that you're looking for.
Okay, great. Chris, thank you so much again for joining us. We are going to have a guest visitor to Startup Pitch Hangout next week, and that's Miriam Rivera. She is the CEO of KFA, but she's also a former vice president at Google, and she's a very active seed investor and has been part of the Kaufman Fellows program in venture capital. So she's heard hundreds of pitches, so she'll be a good one to ask some questions of. And thanks everybody for joining us, and we hope you join the class.